Hello, my name is Dr. Susan Robbins, and the course is Comparative Human Behavior Theory. Hello, class.
Hello.
Okay, you're saying hello to all the future viewers.
Hello.
Okay. To the PowerPoint for a second, please. Today we're going to be talking about theories of acculturation, assimilation, and bicultural socialization. Back over to me. Essentially what we're going to be talking about are theories of culture change and culture adaptation. We're going to start with something that's not a theory, but it's a practice model, and it's a model that you're going to be using specifically for your midterm papers, at least in 2000. What is this date? 2009, right? And this is a model that was developed by Dolores Norton. Back over to the PowerPoint for one moment. And it's called the dual perspective. Essentially, the dual perspective is a practice model that helps social work practitioners consider both the individual's culture of context, their initial culture, as well as the larger Anglo-sustaining system. What this model says is that minority persons, this was written specifically for racial, ethnic minorities. This can be somewhat applied to other kinds of minorities, but this is really written for racial and ethnic minorities. And it says that minority people must be viewed within two different contexts. The first context that Norton called the nurturing system is the immediate and extended family as well as the immediate community. So let's go over to the tablet. The I is for the individual. Okay, what Norton says is that minority people grow up in two distinct systems. The first is what she calls their nurturing system. Let's see, that's an M. This is a challenge for left-handed people working with this tablet. Again, the nurturing system is their immediate and extended family and immediate community. Back over to me for a minute. Yeah, thanks. When children are raised, what's the first system that they encounter? Their parents, their immediate community, and all of the values that go with that. It is their primary context. So as children become socialized into their primary context, typically what happens is that the degree of intimacy is extremely high. And the family and the community typically conveys love, approval, security, safety. That's hopefully what children get. Very importantly, what Norton says is that in minority communities, very importantly, cultures and tradition, history, language, values, ethnicity, are communicated where? Through the family relationships, right? Communicated through the family relations. And it is this way the cultural heritage gets passed on from one generation to the next. Very importantly, within this nurturing system, children usually have very valued roles. They usually have fairly high self-esteem, and they have a sense of belonging. Also very importantly, this is where children first learn what is quote-unquote correct behavior. Any questions about that? Okay, to the PowerPoint for a moment. However, minority children are also part of a larger system that Norton calls the sustaining system. The sustaining system. Now back over to the tablet, please. And in that's the nurturing system, and this is the sustaining system. And what do we have in the sustaining system? It's larger Anglo society, and we're going to talk about what I mean by Anglo in a minute. It's the larger society that includes all of the goods and services. What else does it include? Yeah, Jane.
The educational system.
It includes the educational system. What else, folks? Yeah, Sarah.
The religious system? Religious system?
It contains, well, there is a religious system within the nurturing community as well, within the nurturing system, but in the sustaining system, that's where you're going to find most of the majority culture, churches, synagogues, mosques. And you're also correct when you say the religious system. We have an overriding belief, in the United States at least, that Christianity, or Judeo-Christian beliefs, are the predominant beliefs, even though that's not necessarily going to be the case in the future. What else do we have in the sustaining system? Yeah, Lorena.
The legal system?
The legal system, very importantly. Legal system with all of our laws and policies. What else was in the sustaining system? Yeah, Linda.
The political power. Politics.
The political power. Political power. Very, very importantly. What happens is that when children become exposed eventually to the sustaining system, where they go out and go to school, when they start school, very often what happens is that the values, the behaviors that they have been taught are important in their nurturing system conflict with what is said is important in the sustaining system. So you have just an innate conflict sometimes between the two systems if the values, attitudes, cultures, and norms are very different. Doesn't always happen, but it typically happens. And what Norton says is that what might occur with this are either overt or sometimes covert messages of racism and inferiority. Very importantly, behaviors that are valued in one system become devalued in the other system. And therefore, Norton says, this leaves children, as they are growing up, with an inherent internal conflicts, because they're being forced, on one hand, to adapt to the majority sustaining system. On the other hand, they have grown up with the values and beliefs and behaviors that are valued in their nurturing system. Any questions about that? Back to the PowerPoint. What Norton says is that when we look at human development, and this goes to the heart of human development, because where do minority children develop first? Which system? Everybody. You've got to use the mics. In the nurturing system. However, they also are part of this larger sustaining system. And what Norton says is that when we look at minority people, that we've got to look at their development as being a combination of cultural elements from both systems. Combination of elements from both systems. And she says what we need to pay particular attention to when we're working with people is that when there is incongruence between the two systems, that is where we find conflict. Again, where there is incongruence. Where there is congruence, there is no conflict. If the nurturing system has a set of expectations that is similar to the sustaining system, there's not a whole lot of conflict. When there is incongruence, there is conflict. Can you think of examples in which we're going to find conflict? Yeah, Sarah.
It might be a silly example, but the arranged marriages, it becomes kind of a conflict here in the United States when immigrants come to the United States and they try to mingle with other cultures and they fall in love with the wrong culture or the wrong ethnicity. Or
no, that's a very good example. It's a very good example. Some cultures believe very strongly still in arranged marriages, and these are arrangements that are made by the parents. And when they come to the United States, sometimes, well, we're going to be talking later on today about assimilation and acculturation. Sometimes the children assimilate or acculturate and give up those norms or no longer respect those norms, and as you're pointing out, fall in love with the wrong person, not the person that they're supposed to be married to. Can you think of other examples? Yeah.
Discipline.
Okay, give me an example. That's a good one.
Well, some believe in more time out or talking to, where some people believe in physical punishment to discipline children.
Okay, some cultures have very culturally prescribed ways of punishing children that might not be in concert with the train in thought today in the United States. Why do I say that? Because our train of thought about our ideas about how to raise children changes from generation to generation. If you take a look at parenting books from 50 years ago, they're different from parenting books today. But many times there are cultural beliefs about how you raise a child. It's not just punishment, but also child rearing that are in contrast with what we believe should be done. Other examples. Over here, Megan.
I would say language, as far as either different dialects or usage of language, or also whether you speak English in the home. A lot of children may not speak English in the home as their first language, but then when they go to school, they're expected to speak perfect English.
Well, now that's a really good example, because we have this movement in the United States for English only, English only. And what happens to a child who speaks fluent Spanish or fluent whatever language, fluent Chinese, fluent Japanese in the home? They get into our school system, and what are they told? English only. English only. Speak English here. And there you have a high degree of incongruence, where they're being given messages of approval for speaking their language of origin in their family and in their community. And they're being told by the largest sustaining system that that language is not valued. Other examples? Yeah, Linda.
Education. If someone comes from a blue-collar family, they might not get support for higher education.
Okay, can you be more concrete about how that is?
Well, even with different cultures, some cultures may, approve of higher education where others don't.
I think what you're getting at really gets to the heart of certain cultural beliefs. Certain cultures, education, and particularly higher education, is so much a part of the culture. Other cultures, it's not that they devalue education, but they might not value that type of education. I would hate to say that there is any culture that doesn't value education, but we might define it very, very differently. Anna, and then back here.
Could it be also like the courtesy rules in the communities, like what is considered courteous in their culture, and then they go to the sustaining culture, and that crashes somehow with what they know, what is right?
Very definitely. We have different norms, different customs, different ways of being courteous or discourteous, and those norms and customs might clash dramatically. And today I'm going to give you some concrete examples of that. Andrea.
Religion.
Speak a little bit about that.
Well, in the United States as a whole, we tend to value Christianity, and whereas some other cultures may have, like the Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism or anything like that, we look down, or we as Americans look down upon other religions as if they're not good enough or they aren't comparable.
And in fact, even though we are founded on the idea of freedom of religion, yes? Even though we are founded on the idea, and in fact we do allow people freedom of religion, we still hold one set of religions or one set of spiritual beliefs, religious beliefs, as being the pinnacle of beliefs. And if you take a look at how this country was founded, and we are going to talk about that today, it was the notion of manifest destiny, that this was going to be a Christian nation. And even though we allow freedom of religion, there is still the notion that this should be a Christian nation. Okay, good examples. Yeah, Jean.
The consideration of the extended family.
You have to use the mic.
The extended family and respect for taking care of that extended family. I saw the movie Gran Torino, which is a silly movie, but the Hmong, it seemed like they had grandmother and great-grandmother, and they were always together and cooking together, and there was like a respect and responsibility for the elders.
Yeah, so the way in which different cultures treat the elderly in their society might be very different. One of the things that we can't ignore is the fact that technology has made a very big change in that. I want you to think about that for a second. Technology, first of all, we are living longer. People are living longer. Second of all, people many times used to live in close geographic proximity, many times in the same household with extended family members. Technology and the ability to travel and move has changed that. And cultural norms change over time. No culture stays static. That's one thing I really want to impress here, is that no culture, including Anglo culture, stays static. Okay, so what Norton tells us, back to the PowerPoint, is that when you are doing assessments of clients, you must do an assessment of both systems. In other words, you really need to know the culture of origin of the client that you are working with, to know what those cultural expectations and norms and values are. But you can't stop there. You also have to know the cultural expectations of the larger sustaining system, to know what the norms, beliefs, values, and behaviors are that are expected in that system. So let's stop for a second and think about this, everybody. What is the challenge there for us as social workers? Do we know our own system fairly well? You're saying no. I want to hear why not, Andrea.
I would say probably not, because for the most part, you kind of just go on what you've been taught and what you've known and grown up with, and you don't really question that. And anything extra that you learn is via education, and again, you still don't question it. So it could be totally biased just from your own life experiences.
Okay, so what you're saying then is that sometimes we have blinders based on the limited knowledge of the world that we know. But at the same time, we are all socialized into that larger sustaining system. So we have some basic idea about the expectations and the values, right? Yeah, Marina, you had your hand up.
I think it's hard to know stuff about all the different cultures, too, that we have to be really aware, and that takes a lot of work to research all the cultures, and I don't think that we know enough about all the different cultures.
No, and it really presents a challenge when you live in a multicultural city like Houston. Because in any agency that you are working in as social workers, and any venue that you're working in, you're likely to come across multicultural people from a lot of different cultures. And it's very hard to do an adequate assessment of a nurturing system if you are not enmeshed and engaged in that system. You can read about it, you can learn about it, and very often what we come out with is stereotypes. Yes? Well, in how many classes have you heard about the black family or the Mexican-American family, right? And what we end up doing is stereotyping people and not really getting to the heart of necessarily their culture and their particular beliefs. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that today, about how we have different rates of assimilation and acculturation. So it's very hard to say that even given what we know about any one culture, how that person, how that individual fits into that particular culture. But you bring up a very good point that it's almost impossible for all of us to be experts on all cultures. What Norton would say, though, is that if you're working in an agency or in a community that has specific cultural groups, and you have repeated contact with these same groups, that it really is your responsibility to get to know their culture. And in fact, she would go one step further and say that you're not going to be able to do effective work. Knowing the culture is one part, and you've got to know that, but you have to be invited into the culture. You have to be invited into the culture. They have to accept you. It's not just you knowing them, but they have to accept you. When I was working on the Seminole Indian Reservation in Florida, I was very lucky. I went there as a student. I did an internship there, and then they hired me to do some work in their drug abuse department and criminal justice department. And I was very lucky that I wasn't being asked to work one-on-one with the adolescents that I was there that I wanted to work with initially, because it took them a year and a half. It took me a year and a half to feel accepted. And a lot of that was me sitting at my desk, doing paperwork, interacting with them, but not forcing myself on them. And how did I know when I was finally invited in? I was literally invited over to somebody's house. And from that, I got invited to somebody else's house and somebody else's house. And that's when I had a sense that at least some of the people accepted me. And what Norton would say is that knowing the culture is not enough. When you're working with people, for you to do effective work, you must not only know the culture, but be invited into their culture, into their nurturing system. Does that make sense to y'all? Now here's the problem. Here's the problem. Many of us work in agencies that don't give us that year and a half. I was very, very lucky, right? I was extremely lucky that I had that time to be able to do that. But many times we have job prescriptions that say we have to do an assessment by so-and-so date. We've got to come up with some kind of intervention or treatment plan. And we don't have the time. Yeah, you had your hand up. Andrea.
I would think that wouldn't that cause a problem? Like, it's important to be culturally competent, but to fully know, then that will mean we only work with probably one population, right?
Now, that's a good question. I think it's possible to learn more than one culture, but you have to really spend time with the people. You have to be able to hang out, get to know them. And here's the hard part, is taking our own cultural blinders off. Taking our own cultural blinders off, because what does that, our own cultural blinders prevent us from seeing the strengths in their culture, in their families, in their communities. Remember we talked about this last time, how we tend to see people through eyes of deficiency? And it's very, very important for us to go in totally, totally open-minded. Now, how many of us really think we can do that? You're saying yes, Anna? Anybody else think they could just automatically do that? Well, I thought so too, and I was wrong. I thought so too. Again, when I had worked with other Indian populations, and yet you come across things that go, sometimes that are culturally specific, that go against our grain in the larger Anglo society. And sometimes, I'll give you an example. I don't know whether I've used this example, but I know I don't think I've used this on tape. One of the teenagers that I was working with, her name was Jennifer, who had a child out of wedlock and was pretty much raising the child, I'm not going to say on her own. I mean, she had her own house, individual house, but she had an entire kinship network to help raise the child. I remember there was one time that I saw, her daughter's name was Amanda. Amanda was 3, 4, 5, and she had bruises, scratches from playing. Not from being beaten or battered. But she had an open wound, and I said to her, Jennifer, why don't you go to the doctor? She said, I will. And she didn't. And I saw the child the next day, Jennifer, why don't you take Amanda to the doctor? She said, I will. And she didn't. Any idea what's going on there? She was trying to please me by saying, I will, but she had no intention of doing that. I finally had to slap myself upside the head and say, Susan, who are you to tell her how to raise her child? By the way, Amanda is now in her 30s or 40s and somehow survived that scrape very, very well without my intervention. You're following me? She had her own cultural dictates about what she was going to do with Amanda, and I needed not to intervene. There was certainly nothing life-threatening. I know the minute we hear children, we think, what? Oh, we have to protect them, right? Well, there was nothing there for me to protect Amanda from, other than myself and my values. And somehow she managed to heal without my intervention. Y'all following that? So very often, while we think we can, and I thought that I could, there were many things that I encountered when I was working on the reservation that I had to step back, and I finally realized these folks have been raising their kids for centuries without my help, without my guidance. And who am I to step in and tell them what they should do in something that I see as a medical necessity, and they didn't. And sure enough, in this case, they were right. So it is much harder than we think. It's much, much harder than we think. Yeah, Anna.
I think that, as you say, it's our responsibility as social workers to try to learn the culture that we're going to work with. But not, besides just learning, I think that we need to have an open view of learning something new and trying not to compare it to our culture, because that's where we get defensive about it. Just looking at it with fresh eyes and thinking that your own person is going to enrich from knowing other ways of living, from other cultures.
Absolutely. No, what you're saying is right, but what I'm saying is that it's hard to do. Yeah. That's exactly what we should be doing, but it's not as easy as we think it might be. And I'm telling you that I ran up against my own value conflicts. And I finally had to realize that it is not my job to superimpose my values on them. Now, if I saw something that was clearly dangerous, I certainly would have done and said something. But it's like I was continually, throughout the almost 4 years that I worked on the reservation, it was like I would smack myself upside the head and say, Susan, get your cultural values out of this. And I finally got fairly good at doing that, but it was a process. It was a process. So does everybody understand why we have to do assessments of both? And so what we're looking for is where there is congruence and where there is incongruence. Again, where there is congruence and where there is incongruence between the two systems. And it is only when we have a better idea of that we're going to be able to see what kind of assistance we can give at what level. I think all too often what we try to do is try to get the individual to adapt to the sustaining system, rather than trying to get the sustaining system to adapt to the cultural norms of different people. Now, there's a reality there, and I want to be clear about this. If we're talking about adaptation, in order for people to economically survive, they must have some degree of adaptation to the larger sustaining system. I'm going to give you real concrete values. Native Americans, in general, and I don't mean to stereotype, in general, as a group, tend to be very present time oriented, rather than future time oriented. It was not uncommon for people to show up, quote unquote, late for work. It wasn't late to them, but it was late by the Anglo-dominant system rules and guidelines. To them, it was not a big deal. But people, obviously, if they're going to succeed economically, have to do some amount of adaptation to what the expectations are of the larger culture. That is different, and we're going to be talking about this in greater detail, than asking people to culturally adapt. That is different than asking people to give up all of their culture so that they can become more like us. It is certainly possible to adapt economically, and we're going to talk today about bicultural socialization, without giving up one's basic core values. Any questions about that? Okay, to the PowerPoint. When we take a look at theories of assimilation and acculturation, let's start with a basic definition. When we're talking about Anglo, and I use that term throughout, what that denotes is what Norton calls what? The sustaining system, right? What we're talking about is the mainstream American culture. And this culture is derived historically from Western European, white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant heritage. So whenever I use the term Anglo, that is specifically what I'm talking about. Last week we talked about Anglo values. Do you remember that? And it's really important because Western values are the Anglo norms that are assumed to be superior. Assumed to be superior to those of other cultures. We talked about this last lecture, is that people who fail to conform to our Anglo norms are very often painted as being pathological, marginal, and we're going to talk about that more today, or deficient. And last lecture we talked in great detail about deficiency formulations of people. Okay, early assimilation ideology. Early assimilation ideology. Back over to me for a second. We've got to think about when America was first formed, when America was first colonized. We brought with it this ideal of Anglo-conformity. We brought with it the ideal of Anglo-conformity. It was based on the assumption that we needed to maintain English cultural patterns, English cultural institutions, languages. And this was seen as being not only desirable, but also necessary in order for people to prosper in the new world that was to become the United States. I mentioned this earlier. Assimilation ideology, as we were conquering this country, it rested on the doctrine of something called manifest destiny. Manifest Destiny. It was a historical belief that the United States was destined and divinely ordained by the God of Christianity. That's what Manifest Destiny was about. And therefore, as we took over this country, Anglo-conformity was seen as being a necessary part of socialization of everybody who was going to be here. And back over to the tablet, please. Here's my tablet challenge to try to change pages. Come on. There we go. Assimilation ideology assumed this. If we have Group A who is coming from a different culture, and here is Group B, that is us, we expect them to conform to us. We expect them to give up all of their cultural beliefs, all of their norms, all of their behaviors, the things that they value, and take on the values of mainstream society. So we believe that in the process of becoming assimilated, which we saw as necessary, that they give up their culture and adapt to American values and culture and traditions. That was one of the earliest theories about assimilation and acculturation. Back over to me. Much of the theory that was being generated about assimilation and acculturation took place at the turn of the century. So who are the immigrants at the turn of the century, 1900s? Who were the immigrants coming over here in the early 1900s, folks? Yeah,
White European.
White European minorities. We have an influx of who? Irish, Italian, German, Jewish, Polish, etc., etc. Essentially, they were people who were white, but spoke different languages, came from different cultures, different countries. And therefore, we felt that it was important for them to assimilate, take on our language, take on our culture, take on our values, and in the process, give up their own languages, give up their own cultures. Now, that's easy to do when you're white. Maybe not for the first generation, because what are first generation people stuck with, in a sense? Okay, I've got to hear you.
Their home and what they came from, what they're used to.
Okay, they have their own traditions, they have their own values, but for people who wanted to assimilate, they still have an accent. They come over here speaking different languages, and it was hoped that through successive generations that the accent would disappear. Yes? That people could successfully assimilate, not only speak the language, but almost become accent-free. Because they did not grow up with that language of origin as being the only language. Other models of assimilation. Have you all heard that America is a melting pot? What does that mean when you think about melting pot? Yeah, Sarah.
Different cultures mixed in, marriages, mixed marriages, and people from different parts of the world mixing here in the United States.
Okay, the idea that we could all live harmoniously together, that we have essentially, that we could put people in a melting pot of different cultures, so we have a lot of different cultures, and we would all meld into this new national character. You all following that? Not that people would keep their original identity, but the melting pot idea is the idea that we have people who are Polish, people who are German, people who are Jewish, that we would all mold into this new character called the American citizen. I want to point out that even though that sounds nice, it is still a linear model. Let's go back to this. It's a linear model. It doesn't assume that they become us, but rather that we all melt into this and create something new. So essentially, we are still asking people to give up their cultural heritage to become this new American. You'll see how it's still based on assimilation? Because we're asking people to give up their cultures. It's what they saw as a new enmeshing of people. The difference between traditional assimilation is that one viewed them as becoming predetermined or predefined character, and the other, the melting pot, saw them as becoming a new American character. But it still required giving up your own cultural norms. As we take a look at how theory about assimilation and acculturation progressed, by 1915, let's see, very importantly, over to the PowerPoint, early theories of assimilation were linear, and they really did stress the Americanization of immigrant groups. And you either had to conform to a predefined national character or become a new national character. Melting pot theory, we just talked about, it still reflected assimilation ideology. But what happens, and this is important because I think it's very seductive to think about melting pot being a good thing. The new national character is definitely based on Anglo-dominant norms. Are you all following that? That melting pot sounds good in theory, but when you take a look at what we're really saying, that what we're really asking people to do is become this new character that is based on Anglo-dominant norms. As theory progressed and we started to take a look at theories of cultural pluralism, these are the theories that rejected Anglo-conformity and melting pot theories. And what they proposed is that cultural pluralism was based on a different process, not assimilation, but acculturation. Again, not assimilation, but acculturation. Okay, so let's take a look at what we mean by acculturation. And I'm going to have a challenge over here again. Come on, change pages. Okay, acculturation is based on the idea, a different kind of model. Back to the PowerPoint for a minute. We're going to go flipping back and forth. It's a process of changing one culture by incorporating elements of the other culture. Sounds good in theory, doesn't it? Changing one culture by incorporating elements of another culture. And the result is a new culture that contains elements of both cultures. Okay, back over to the tablet for a minute. So here we have culture A, and here we have culture B. And here is where we have this new culture. Do you see that? What emerges is culture C. That is a blending. So we're not asking people to become totally conform to Anglo society, but rather the idea that people can acculturate and become this new kind of person that contains elements of both. Let's stop and look at the problem with this. Back to the tablet for a second. We're still asking people to give up a significant part of their culture. It's still a somewhat linear model. Are you all following that? While it's not quite melting pot where we're melting into this new American citizen, we are allowing people to keep some of their culture, change colors, which is right here. But once they become that, look at what they've given up. They've given up all of that. You all following that? So in a sense, it still is a somewhat linear model, not as linear. Back to the PowerPoint. If we want to talk about true cultural pluralism, the way to think about it is a salad bowl. If you can picture a big salad bowl, there's some lettuce in there, there's some cucumbers, some onions, some tomatoes, and it's the idea that people can just live harmoniously together in this salad bowl so that the cucumbers get along with the tomatoes and the tomatoes get along with the onions and they get along. You're following that? However, for this to really happen and for this to be realistic, it depends on minimal power disparities or no power disparities between and among the groups. So if we're talking about a real salad, there is no one part of the salad that has more power than the other. But when you start talking about cultural groups in the United States, where does the power still reside? Anybody? Where does the power reside? Jean?
The majority Anglo.
Yeah, the power still resides within majority Anglo culture. So therefore, it is really safe to say that the idea of this cultural pluralism salad bowl, it's an ideal, but in reality, it simply does not exist. So the question is, do we have many different cultures living here? Yes. Relatively harmoniously, yes? All the time harmoniously? No. And why not?
They have differences, and beliefs and culture beliefs.
Yeah, it's harmonious when there is congruence and not harmonious when there is incongruence. And because of different values, norms, and cultural beliefs, very often cultural minorities come right up against a power structure that says you must do it our way. So again, the idea of cultural pluralism is very nice in theory, and it's an ideal, but we're not there. Nor can we ever be there when there is differential power among groups. Does that make sense to y'all? Very importantly, these linear models of assimilation, acculturation, what they fail to really appreciate and take into consideration is the crucial roles that language, religion, and history play in preserving family identity and group culture. Again, let me repeat that. What these linear models of assimilation fail to account for and fail to appreciate is the very important roles that language, religion, and a people's history play in preserving family culture and group culture. Now, I want you to think back to the early 1900s. Did some people successfully assimilate? Yes or no? We can't hear you without the mics.
Yes.
And what made them able to assimilate? Yeah, Andrea.
The ability to want to adjust and to adjust to changes that were going on.
Okay, the ability, first of all, to want to adjust. And people, by the way, when people immigrated to the United States back in the early 1900s and up to the 1950s, people wanted to become American. I mean, there was a very strong urge to become American because America was the land of opportunity. So some people did, in fact, assimilate. They gave up their cultures. And sometimes when I speak to people, they talk about their loss of culture, that they wish that they had grown up knowing more about their culture because their parents had so totally assimilated that they had given up the original cultural norms. And it's not surprising to see people going back in search of their culture, their cultural group, sometimes generations later. So yes, people were able to assimilate. And part of the successful assimilation had to do with the fact that they're talking about white immigrants. And therefore, we cannot, once they have adopted our norms, our values, they've gotten rid of their accents, they've gotten rid of their language, we can't tell them from us. The problem with trying to force assimilation on people of color is that no matter how much they adopt our culture, our values, we still have one basis on which we can discriminate because they are identifiably different because of the color of their skin, the shape of their face, their eyes, etc., etc. You all following that? Clearly, we allow people who look more like us to assimilate more thoroughly. That make sense to y'all? Any questions? Okay. There is a bicultural socialization. Very importantly, so now we're coming to a different period of time and theories about acculturation and assimilation. It's partly an outgrowth of Norton's work, Dolores Norton's original work on the dual perspective. Very importantly, back over to me for a minute. It was long believed that people who were culturally different, who were trying to assimilate to the United States, had a very difficult time because they straddled. I mean, literally they were seen as straddling two cultures. And they were portrayed as being marginal people. Early 1900s, there was a lot of writing about the quote-unquote marginal man. The idea that somebody who is culturally different can never fully assimilate into mainstream culture as long as they have one foot in their culture of origin. And therefore, they were seen as marginal people who did not fit into either culture. That make sense, y'all? Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Newer theories of bicultural socialization suggest that rather than being marginal, that people can preserve their culture and master the new culture. And therefore, they can achieve mastery not only of their culture of origin, but also of the larger dominant culture. And what this model suggests a very different type of acculturation, because here we see people being able to fully integrate not just one culture, but fully integrate the positive qualities of both cultures. Any questions about that? Okay, two concepts are really important here. No questions about bicultural socialization? Let me stop before we go forward. Is it possible? What do you think? Is it possible for anybody to become truly bicultural and not be marginal?
I do think so. I think I'm an example. I'm half Latin American. I'm Peruvian. I feel very Peruvian, and I feel very American at the same time, and I don't think I'm discriminated against in either one of them. I may be a little bit of a different, not the typical, because I'm not dark-skinned.
Okay.
So that may give me maybe advantages someplace, and a little bit of disadvantages in the other also.
Because you're not dark-skinned, when you go into the one of the culture of origin, there might be some discrimination. Yeah, Anna.
I agree with Jeannie. I think that it is possible to assimilate in a bicultural way. In my case, I do experience discrimination because I'm dark. And I have had instances, many instances, that I get discriminated against because of that. But in my mind, I think that I am fortunate to be able to have the best of both worlds. I mean, the discrimination is just a small part for me, that it doesn't bother me. And I had the fortune to expand my world to another different world. You know, I had the best of both worlds.
Okay, rather than assimilating, we're talking about acculturating, and there's a difference, because assimilation means you have to give up one part of the culture. When you can acculturate in a different way, in a bicultural way, where you really adapt behaviors, values, norms of both cultures, and you act accordingly depending on which culture you're interacting with. Yeah, Andrea.
I'm not sure if I think it's possible, just because sometimes it's a very fine line, and then you have to go one way or another, and it might not be right. And also, what you've learned from another, you might identify more with and be more prone to identify with that. And so in another culture, it's not acceptable, but that's something that you personally, let's say you like it, and so you're more prone to do that. And so I think I'm not sure if I think that you could.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, Linda.
I think that it's possible, but the person would really have to have a strong personality or not let it bother them. I think
Is it a strong personality they need, or strong support systems, or both?
Yeah, that's probably better. Strong support system to where it doesn't mess with their self-esteem.
What I have seen firsthand is that a lot of people who are comfortable with this bicultural socialization, because of the color of their skin, they still get, as you're pointing out, Anna, discriminated against in one of the systems and not the other. or in both of the systems, and I've seen it happen both ways. So it is a balancing act, but it can be done. Yeah, Andrea.
I guess my question would be, what about in a culture where you should be more submissive and in another culture you should be more outgoing? So then what?
We're coming to that because there's a model that says that there's no reason that, in fact, bicultural socialization says that there's no reason that you can't do that. What it suggests is that you act appropriate in the culture that you're in. And we're going to end with this idea that we could have multiple selves. It's a very different model. Well, it's a very different model. And it says that you can adapt to and adopt the norms of each culture and just act culturally appropriate within context. So in other words, I'm going to give you an example, give you a concrete example. I was talking earlier about Jennifer, her younger sister Keiji, who I used to work with. A typical interaction between myself, actually not just Keiji, but almost any of the kids who I was working with. When they were talking to me, they would look me straight in the eye. The minute they talked to an Indian elder, they would turn around, eyes lowered, which was culturally appropriate. If I asked them a question, they would turn back to me with eye contact. You following that? What that says is that they have totally internalized what is necessary for which culture, and it becomes so automatic that they're able to do that. Now, that's not dissimilar to what you're saying, is that sometimes when you're interacting in your cultural context, you have to be a certain way. And yet, when you get into the larger context, there are different expectations, and therefore, you've got to act a different way. And that's why people were seen as being marginal and straddling. And what theories of bicultural socialization say, that some people get so adept at doing this that it becomes second nature, and that they're not marginal because they're able to fully adapt to the expectations of each culture. Yeah, Tony, could I ask you to sit over here where... Thanks. Yeah, Anna.
And that's what I was also trying to say, that once that you have lived in another culture other than yours, you had to have some kind of bicultural assimilation. I mean, just for living so many years in another country, and probably changes your person, that you will never be the same again, because you become like a part of both worlds. It is impossible for you not to assimilate, and it develops a lot of diplomacy in your acting, in your things. You have the sensibility to know what to do and what to say in this environment and in the other one. I mean, it's just the way it is.
Yeah, Lorena.
I don't know that I agree that it can be done in both cultures equally. I think that however you're raised in whatever culture is what's comfortable, and that in another culture, if you're doing bicultural socialization, if you're in a culture that maybe is more suppressive than your origin of culture, that, I mean, eventually I think little things might seep out that are similar to your culture. I mean, I don't know that I agree that you could always act appropriately in the other culture.
So you're saying that sometimes, and this goes, thank you, because you're leading me right to the next part of the lecture, that sometimes there is conflict. So let's take a look at some concepts. Back to the PowerPoint. Bicultural conflict. That occurs, and this is what you're addressing, Lorena, that occurs when the values and behaviors of your culture of origin and the minority culture not just different, but conflict with those of the larger culture. And one of the things that we have to recognize is that bicultural conflict is a fact of life. If there are power disparities between the two groups, it goes back to power. It goes back to power differences, power differentials. When there are power differences, bicultural conflict is simply a fact of life. If there are no power differences, it would not make a difference. In other words, difference wouldn't matter. But when there are power conflicts and power disparities, and one group has the right to tell the other group how to act, that's when you start getting into bicultural conflict. Does that make sense? Back to the PowerPoint. Bicultural tension is a different concept. Bicultural tension occurs when a person only has coping skills for one of the two systems in which they have to interact. Again, bicultural tension occurs when a person has coping skills not for both systems, but for only one of the systems. So essentially, bicultural tension results from an inadequate repertoire of coping skills. Yeah, Anna.
Can I give a specific example?
Sure.
Like, let's say in Mexico, when you're invited to a gathering or to a dinner, it is bad manners to be there on time. You had to be like 20 minutes late to be considered courteous. If you're right there on time, that's so bad manners. Now, here in America, it is necessary to be on time. That's the good manners. So you have to have, like it says in the book, the coping skills to adapt to wherever you are to comply with those requirements. If I would say, no, but in Mexico you are right late, so I'm going to arrive. I'm not in Mexico, so I'm here, so I need to do what I need to do.
So it really is a question of not only having the knowledge, but having the coping skills for both of those cultures. And what you're pointing out, Lorena, is that sometimes in the process of doing this, I think this is what you're saying, is that people come to value one culture more than the other, and it creates tension for them. Is that part of what you were saying?
Value it, and also just, it's the norm for them. I mean, so it's hard to completely assimilate or acculturate to, I mean, it's hard to be part of both cultures. I think that, you know, that you can be in one, there's a dominant culture in you, in other words.
Okay, and what I think that what people would say about that, I think what could be said about that is that if you are so dominant culture oriented, then you are not truly bicultural. And therefore, the conflict that you have is the bicultural tension because you have not developed an adequate repertoire for dealing with the other culture. Does that make sense?
Well, like, let me give you an example. Okay. Like, I play soccer with a bunch of people that are from different Hispanic cultures. And just like she's talking about being late, we have talked to them several times about coming on time because the game starts at 3. Doesn't start at 3:15, doesn't start at 3:20. You know, and so they'll do it for a short amount of time. But then all of a sudden, they'll start 3:05, 3:10, you know.
And how many of in this group, how many of them are from a different culture?
Most. I mean, it's
so you're the one that's out of compliance.
I would say actually it depends because I play with different people, but in one group it's about 50-50. So the people that are of the Anglo group get frustrated that the other ones, but then we kind of joke about it and just say, you know, like we'll say we're not on Mexico's time here. Come here at this time with our guys that are from, you know, Mexico, and they come at, you know, 15 minutes after, you know. So we just kind of joke with them, but it seeps out in them. You know, they'll start
and you know
slacking.
Because it's a recreational group, what you have there is cultural misunderstanding. Because it's a recreational group, you don't have power over them, nor do they have power over you, and therefore what you have is cultural misunderstanding. I mean, my suggestion to you would be get used to the fact that they're going to get there when they get there.
They do. That's why we joke about it. That's why we joke about it now.
Now, the difference is if this was a work situation where there is a power disparity, they would have to conform. Otherwise, they would lose their jobs. You're following that? And I think that what you're giving the example of is a very good example of how people assert their own culture when there are no power disparities. What they're saying to you essentially is, get over it. Does that make sense? But if they have jobs and they're showing up to their jobs on time, that says that they have become fully bicultural because they know where the power is. And they know where they have to adapt and where they don't have to adapt. And because yours is a sports group, they don't have to adapt. Does that make sense? Now, it would be a problem if that same person worked on their culture of origin time all the time. They would find themselves unemployed and out in the streets, right? or they'd have to go find a job within their own cultural group that was going to pay them enough to sustain themselves. So again, what we have to be very conscious of is the power disparities. And I think it's very easy for us to say, we're in America, speak English. We're in America, be on time, when in fact there's no mandate for them to do that. Does that make sense to y'all? We are very uncomfortable around cultural differences, and those cultural differences are very real. I'm telling you, when I say I had to slap myself up by the side of my head over and over by saying, Susan, get out of your Anglo frame when you're in another culture. Because if you really want to understand people, you've got to be able to take their perspective. First of all, you've got to be able to respect their norms, even though they're not your norms. It's very, very difficult. It's very, very difficult because we grow up with our sets of beliefs about what we think is right. The right way to raise children, the right way to be on time, the things that we think are just normal that, everybody should conform to. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Very importantly, and I cannot stress this enough, bicultural conflict is a fact of life. Anytime you've got culturally different groups and one group has more power over the other, you have bicultural conflict. You cannot get rid of that. So again, bicultural conflict is a fact of life. Bicultural tension is not. People can develop a repertoire of coping skills to cope in both systems. It's when they do not develop those coping skills that they are not as well adjusted. Does that make sense? Did you have your hand up? Any questions about that? None? Okay. Yeah, Andrea.
So, at what point do you identify getting by and coping as different? At what level is it different?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Try again.
For instance, if someone immigrates here and they don't speak English and they don't necessarily learn, but they have a child who interprets everything for them, is that just getting by or is that coping?
Well, they are not bicultural and they do not have coping skills for the larger Anglo society. And we're going to talk about that next. We're going to talk about different models of adaptation. And some people, there's no one path to acculturation or assimilation, and some people choose not to do what you're saying. And very often what we see when we're working with clients in the real world, what we see very often are generational differences. First generation folks sometimes, particularly when grandparents come over, they have a much harder time adapting to the new society that they've come to, whereas their children very often are somewhat assimilated, sometimes acculturated, and their grandchildren are totally assimilated. And that's where you get into intergenerational problems. First of all, do we have intergenerational problems based on age alone? Yes. Where the older folks don't understand the younger folks, and the younger folks don't understand the older folks, right? Well, that goes on in many, many families. That's somewhat normative. When you superimpose on top of the age differences, generational differences, culture differences, whereby you have grandchildren who are so assimilated that they no longer speak their language of origin. That's where you get into not just generational differences, but acculturation differences that create problems in families. So what you're talking about is a mode of adaptation that does not take on any of, or very much of the characteristics of the new culture. So we're going to talk about that next. Any other questions? None? Okay. We're going to turn to a very different model. Dr. Fernando J. Galan, who unfortunately is now deceased, he used to be a faculty member here at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work, yes. In fact, when I was hired 1,000,000 years ago, he was the assistant dean. Yes, I've been here 1,000,000 years at least. Brilliant, brilliant theoretician. And he came up with a different model of bicultural identity. Here's what he said. Let's go to back to the tablet. If I can get a new page up. Here we go. As Dr. Galan looked at these various models of adaptation and acculturation, he said that they're too stagnant. He said, first of all, they're linear. And linear models in which people have to give up their culture don't make a whole lot of sense, because we look around and what do we find? Well, take a look at Houston. Do we have pockets of culture? We have people who are somewhat acculturated to the United States, but yet they live in ethnic enclaves, right? And therefore we have a Chinatown, we have an Italian section, et cetera, et cetera. You're following that? And what he said is that all because people take on the dominant culture does not mean that they necessarily give up their culture of origin. And he said one of the problems we get into is that when we're looking at these linear models of change, is that it really doesn't describe very well what is going on in the United States. So I'm going to sit down because I'm going to be using the tablet a lot. In other words, linear models do not adequately capture the way in which people assimilate, acculturate, or fail to, as you're pointing out. And therefore, he said, we need to get rid of linear models. And rather than it simply being a model of people giving up certain amounts, remember these two models, one, they gave up everything. Another one, they gave up part, but they became this new thing. The model of acculturation is that blending of both, but they're still giving up part of their culture. And what Galan says is that these models, not only do the linear models not work, but these models that put people in categories also are not accurate, because it doesn't truly capture the experience of minorities in a mainstream culture. And what he said is that if we're looking at minority people, it has to capture the dynamics of bicultural socialization. Not everybody gets there, but it has to capture the dynamics. And here's what he proposed. He proposed that we look at it. This is going to be my very bad drawing of Galan's model. That we look at it on an x-axis and a y-axis. The x-axis is the culture of origin. And what do we have on the y-axis? Any guesses? The sustaining system, or Anglo-society. We call that the Anglo-sustaining system. Oops. So in other words, we're talking about what I would call mainstream culture, right? And here is what Dr. Galan proposed. He said, we have to look at it in a transactional sense, that people are not static. Let's start with that. And that people do not necessarily have to give up their culture to take on another culture. And what he pointed to are different models of adaptation. And he says, first of all, we need to plot this out not only on a linear, what do we do before? The x-axis, the culture of origin, and how much they gave up. He said we need to take a look at not only how much they give up of their own culture, but how much they take on of the new culture. So over to the PowerPoint for a minute. So he talked about one kind of adaptation being traditional adaptation. Traditional adaptation. And in traditional adaptation, what we find is a high adherence to the nurturing group. In other words, they take on all of the values of the nurturing group, but they have a low adherence to the sustaining culture. So back over to the tablet for a minute. So if people have a high adherence here and a low adherence here, we could call them traditional. And Andrea, that's what you were talking about. People who have a high adherence, they do not give up their language of origin. They do not give up their cultural norms. They do not give up their values, their cultural values, and they do not take on very much of our norms, the largest sustaining system. Does that make sense? And there are some people that keep that mode of adaptation. Okay, back over to the PowerPoint for a minute. He said, however, we can also take a look at a different kind of adaptation. Different kind of adaptation, and that's what he calls assimilation adaptation. In this, we have a low adherence to the nurturing group. We get a low adherence to the nurturing group, but a high adherence to Anglo values. So back over the tablet for a minute. So here's the low adherence to the cultural group and a high adherence. And what do we have here? People who are totally assimilated. In other words, they don't have their cultural norms. They have given up their cultural norms, and what they've taken on is what? They have become American, okay? But they've become American at the expense of their own culture. And these are people, and this does happen, who give up their language of origin, give up their cultural norms, their cultural values, their cultural beliefs, in order to succeed in mainstream society. Now, what happens when you have a multi-generational family with somebody who is totally assimilated, particularly a younger person, and an older person who is totally traditional? They can't even communicate with each other. They have very, very little in common. Y'all following that? So when you take a look at intergenerational families, this is one of the things that you really have to consider, which is why I'm asking you in this class to really understand the most traditional form of any culture, because that's where we have conflicts. That's where we have conflicts, when we do not understand the norms and beliefs of traditional people. Okay, back to Galan's model, PowerPoint. Another kind of adaptation, he says, is a marginal adaptation. Marginal. These are people who neither subscribe to their culture of origin, nor do they subscribe to mainstream Anglo norms. Again, they have a very low adherence to their own culture and a low adherence to their sustaining group. So back to the tablet, please. And he called these folks marginal. Now, this is not that they are marginal people, but this is marginal adaptation. Y'all following this? Can you think of examples? Can you think of examples of this? People who don't really fit in with their own culture and don't fit in with mainstream society. Examples? You can't think of anything? Yeah. Linda.
What about someone who's biracial? Would that? Because you might not belong to a certain ethnic group.
Well, but what are they conforming to? Which values are they conforming to?
Well, they might not. I mean, they might, go between the two.
Going between the two, if they go between the two, then they've adopted a little bit of each. Again, a marginal person is somebody who doesn't fit in with their own culture and doesn't fit in with Anglo culture.
Could it be gangs, like the gangs for the Hispanics, I guess? Or not really?
Typically, we're looking at people who have dropped out in one way or another. It could be joining up with gangs that are not part of the mainstream Hispanic culture, for example, or any kind, or the mainstream in their culture. They're even seen as outcasts in that culture. You're following that? We're talking about the alcoholics, the drug addicts, people who literally drop out. They do not fit in well with their culture because they're not conforming to the mainstream norms there, and they don't fit very well with mainstream culture either. And what he's pointing out is that some people really do adopt a marginal kind of adaptation. It doesn't have to be permanent. Sometimes it is, but that's one mode of adaptation. So he's saying, do not ignore that sometimes there are people who don't fit with their own culture and don't fit with mainstream culture either, because they have low adherence to anybody's norms. Yeah, Leo. You have to use the mic.
Would a cult be another example of that, or no?
I'm sorry, would what?
Would a cult be another example of that?
I didn't hear the word.
A cult?
O-C-C-U-L-T?
No, a cult.
A cult, C-U-L-T.
Yes.
It's forming a different culture. It's forming a different culture, and it's not part of a culture of origin, and it's not part of mainstream culture either. Here's where we get into definitional problems, because when is something a religious sect, and when does it become a cult? And you've got to remember, well, you're asking very good questions, but this has very little to do with ethnic minorities. Again, this model is about racial and ethnic minorities particularly. And the reason for that is that, again, we've got to think about it in terms of socialization. We've got to think about it in terms of socialization. People who are born into racial ethnic minority groups have a very rich heritage. They are born into groups that have very rich histories and heritages. And yet, when there is conflict between their norms and the mainstream norms, that's where their heritage becomes devalued. So what you're saying is that, I guess you could think of somebody who drops out of all society and joins a cult, C-U-L-T, but only if it's a mode of adaptation to not be part of mainstream society and not be part of their culture of origin. The reason that doesn't fit very well is the majority of young people who end up in cults are white. They're typically white middle-class kids. And, by the way, they tend to join cults and then leave cults. Yeah, Andrea.
Even though, like, I guess gypsies, there is a culture, but would you kind of think of them as marginal? Because for the most part, everybody pretty much, like, finds a place to live and stays there, but they move around, so they're not really seen. They're kind of, like, outcast by almost everybody, I guess, you know.
Well, you've brought up an interesting example because gypsy culture is in fact a culture, and most people born into gypsy culture do not necessarily acculturate, and when they do, they either totally assimilate or they stay within what kind of adaptation is it? Traditional adaptation. Yeah, Ashley.
I was thinking the homeless population could be a good one.
Yeah, when you find somebody from a minority culture who then becomes totally homeless because they are not working or doing productive things in their culture of origin and not able to work within the larger sustaining system. Again, it's pretty much the people who have dropped out. The people who dropped out. Other examples? Other questions? Yeah, Megan.
I was just going to say criminals are people that end up in jail, similar to gang members.
Yeah, because no culture, let's start with this, no culture except possibly gypsy culture, except thinks that crime is good. Well, think about this. And in gypsy culture, that's part of that's certainly part of their normative way of living. But most cultures, but even within gypsy culture, they have their own norms about what is correct and what's not correct. And if people do not conform to their norms within the culture, there are problems for them. You all following that? So that even though gypsy culture is a quote-unquote deviant culture compared to other cultures, they still have their own very strong norms. Does that make sense? Go back with the question again, Megan, was... Oh.
I was just saying criminals also could be people that become convicts or criminals.
Thank you for getting me back on track. Yes, one of the things we've got to consider is that all cultures have their own norms and expectations of people. And most cultures are law-abiding cultures. And therefore, when people start breaking laws and become criminals, they are outcasts not only from the nurturing system standpoint, but also from the standpoint of their own culture of origin. So it's, again, the people who have such low adherence to their own culture of origin that they don't even fit in there, nor do they have any adherence to larger Anglo society, and they don't fit in there either. And that's where you can talk about, rather than the marginal person being somebody who straddles both, it's somebody who has no involvement in either. Do you see the difference? Okay. Finally, different kind of adaptation that he talked about. Galland said there's a different kind of adaptation that he calls, and this is called different things. You can call it bicultural, you could call it acculturated, or you can call it transcultural. All means the same thing. These are people who have high adherence. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. I'm sorry, back to the tablet. These are people who have high adherence to traditional values and high adherence to what? Larger sustaining system values. In other words, they are part of both systems and fully part of both systems. And therefore, they're able to negotiate their way back and forth through the different systems. And what they do is their behavior is appropriate in context. So when they're with Anglos, they act Anglo. When they're in the culture of origin, they follow the norms of that culture. And that's because they have high adherence to both sets of norms, and they have learned how to adapt their behaviors accordingly. Again, go back to the example that I gave you before about Jennifer or Cajun or any of the Indian children. I'm standing next to Winifred, who's a tribal elder. They're talking to me, looking me in the eye. They talk to Winifred, their eyes are down. They talk to me, again, they adapt their behavior to what is expected for the context, for the situation. That's what Galland would call a totally acculturated person, because they have adopted all of the values that go along with what? Their culture of origin, as well as the larger sustaining system. That makes sense to y'all? Okay, Galland further complicates this. Let's go back to the drawing for a second. And he says that not only do we have these different modes of adaptation, but we also have what he calls transitional adaptation. Can everybody read that? It says transitional, not traditional. Transitional. Okay, let's talk about that for a second. Back over to me. Where do we find, in the developmental process, where do we find people having the most confusion typically? During what age? Teenage years. It's a time of major transition. And what Galland says is that very often what we see in teenagers, particularly ethnic minority teenagers, is that they get into this transitional phase where they're trying on different identities, right? And sometimes they can look pretty marginal. Sometimes they can look fairly acculturated, sometimes they can look fairly assimilated. And he says when you're dealing with transitional, the key variable really is age. Not surprisingly, young people tend to acculturate much more quickly than older people. Why do you think that is? Again, young people tend to acculturate much more quickly. Yeah, Naftali.
Well, one of the main reasons is because they're able to learn the language a lot better, because if they are born here in the United States, of course it's easier for them to learn the language and all their values and all that. And for older people, they have the accent, or people who already came here already older, they're going to have the accent and they're going to speak the other language better.
Yes, young people, because they are forced to speak English from fairly early on, whether they are born here or whether they come here when they're young, language is something, we're going to talk more about this later on in this course. There are specific time periods whereby language is easier for people to learn. There are windows, literally developmental windows. So therefore, not that people can't learn languages as they get older, it's just easier when you're younger. So they have an easier time learning the language. They also are expected from the time that they're young to adapt to both cultures. So it's an easier process of adaptation because they are still forming who they are as people. Any other ideas about why younger people might acculturate quicker? Yeah.
Well, a comment about the older people, they're more set in their ways.
How about that? Yes, younger children are still growing. They're not quite as set in their ways. And they also probably have more opportunity to interact with both cultures. Yep.
It's important.
You got to use the mic.
Because in our younger years and teenage years, peers are more important than anything. So we learn to adapt to our peers, and then we catch on that way.
Yes, very definitely. Peers take on a very special role in a teenager's life. And therefore, if you are in the culture of origin only, that's going to be your peer group. But because kids are in schools with other kids who are not necessarily from their culture, all of a sudden the role of peers becomes a very significant part of teenagers' lives. Very importantly, these developmental tasks are not necessarily easy for adolescents either. Even though it's easier for younger people to acculturate, it also temporarily, and this is why Galland called this transitional. They're trying on different roles, different identities, and it can be very, very confusing as they're trying to emerge with their sense of identity. This is really important because many cultures have identity tied up with the family. Our model of individuation, what is the model that we use in the United States? What is the task? We're going to be talking more about this when we talk about Erikson's theory. We are expected to become our own individual person, right? And yet, in many cultures, what are some of the expectations of teenage years? Not to individuate. Yeah, Ashley?
To be like the family, to be like the culture.
To be like the culture. Many times there are significant roles that children are expected to take on in teenage years that are family-based, not individual-based. And what Galland says is that this can be a very stressful time. Remember we talked about cultural tension? This can be a very stressful time because sometimes children at this age, teenagers, are getting conflicting messages about what is expected from them. And therefore, they often turn into this transitional stage in which they're trying on different kinds of adaptation. So sometimes we're going to find them, let's go back to the diagram over here, on the tablet. So not surprisingly, kids can sometimes look fairly marginal. Then they can look very traditional at times. They can look very assimilated, or they can be very acculturated. And that's what that transitional model is about, and it's temporary. What's important about that is that it's temporary. What teenagers are coping with now is forming an identity around two different sets of norms. Did I see somebody's hands up, Lorena?
Well, I was just wondering, you're talking about teens, but can this also cross over into like younger adulthood?
Yes, of course it can.
Okay, because I mean, I'm thinking about someone that I know that was a Kosovoan refugee, and he tried to assimilate, I think, in his early 20s of dating people that were American, and his family rejected it, and now he went back to, he married someone from his own culture, but he tried, but it didn't work. He tried to assimilate in all the, an American and Kosovoan. And right.
I'm not saying that it stops when you're teenagers. It's just that it's what Galland was saying is that it's normative. It's normative for teenagers who come from a different culture to start wrestling with this whole sense of identity when they have two different sets of norms about what identity is supposed to look like. And yes, this can happen not only in young 20s, it can happen throughout life to people, and we're going to come to that. Yeah, Andrew.
I noticed that just even in cultures, if you are in your teens, you are trying to find out who you are, but in a sense, if you identify more with another culture, then you're perceived as acting too black or too white or too Hispanic or too, anything. And so when you see that, then you might try to cross back over.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that kind of plays a role too.
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that I think is a constant is that we are intolerant of people who try to live in two worlds. It's much easier for us to see them as marginal, right? And therefore, when we see somebody who is fully acculturated, who is fully bicultural, it creates problems because from their culture of origin, they're seen as being too white, and they have all kinds of names for them. from Anglo culture, they're seen as being too ethnic, and we have all kinds of names for them too. And it's very hard for us to accept people being truly multicultural or bicultural or transcultural. So yeah, people who do this successfully, it does not mean that they do not experience discrimination. Because remember, bicultural conflict is a fact of life. And with bicultural conflict, what goes along with that is prejudice, discrimination from both sides of the equation. Many times there's a lot of pressure for people from their culture of origin to not become too American. Similarly, there's the opposite pressure from the larger Anglo society to not be too much of your cultural group, to be more like us, because there is still a strong pressure to assimilate. What I really want you to understand, there's a difference between economic assimilation and cultural assimilation. People do have to economically assimilate in the United States if they're going to make a living. And that means that unlike your sports group, where they can be late and they're, in a sense, thumbing their nose at you, saying, get used to it, they've got to be able to assimilate to the requirements of what it takes to make a living. And that means being more Anglo, adopting Anglo values, and conforming to Anglo mandates. But that doesn't mean that they have to give up their culture of origin, because when they're with their cultural group, they can be themselves in that culture. Does that make sense? Yeah, Tony.
I've been trying to figure out where Galan would place an ethnic minority who is also a sexual minority. Like, would they be in transition? Or is it, like, at first I wanted to place them, like, marginal because they're not really fully participating in anything, I guess, except maybe a sexual minority culture.
What you're bringing up is a really interesting issue, because people have tried to apply Galan's model to sexual minorities. People have tried to apply the dual perspective to sexual minorities, and you can, but it's not a good fit. You can, but it's not a good fit. Why is it not a good fit? Because people who are sexual minorities do not typically grow up with a culture that they belong to. Take the sexual minority part separate from culture. In other words, when people start to recognize that they are different from what is expected in the mainstream norm, which is heterosexual, right? Whether they be gay, lesbian, transgendered, when they start to recognize their own difference, they have no cultural group, in most cases, to accept them. They don't have a set of norms, et cetera, et cetera. And what you're pointing out is that sometimes people become marginal not because of the cultural adaptation, but because now we have another minority status superimposed on top of them, right? And again, this goes back to cultural conflict. If we were accepting of people, if we were tolerant of people, people would not have to become marginal. But because we have such strong norms that say heterosexual is the norm, and we do not accept people who are not. Many times adolescents, and it's almost like they're hit with a double whammy, is what you're pointing to, yes? That they're struggling not only with their ethnic identity, but also their sexual identity. And sometimes, in terms of transgendered folks, which we'll be talking about more, their gender identity. It might have nothing to do with sexual identity. It might have to do with how they relate to themselves and their gender. So it's almost a double whammy, so to speak, if they're having to deal with cultural issues and over and above that, issues of gender and or sex. Did that answer your question?
So basically, don't try and put them in any of these, right? Use a different, like a coming out model or the...
I think you have to use a different model, but you have to recognize that because of discrimination, first of all, let's start with power in society. Because there is a dominant Anglo group that has the power to define what is normal and what is not normal, and therefore making everybody who does not fit into that dominant Anglo mode as not normal creates tension and stress. And therefore, there is a lot of pressure to conform, and when people start to discover that they are different, it creates significant discomfort and conflict. And unlike cultural minorities who might have a cultural group that they can turn to, sexual minorities very often don't. Luckily, here in Houston, there are lots of resources. Think about somebody who's growing up in Kansas. Not that Kansas is not metropolitan, parts of it are, but people who are growing up in rural areas who don't have those kind of supports. So it becomes even more of a struggle. So I don't think this model fits sexual minorities quite as well. And I think we have to take a look at other kinds of models, which we're going to. Did I see somebody else's hand up? Okay. Okay, you brought up the point that sometimes it's not just adolescents who go through this transitional adaptation. Sometimes adults do too. Specifically, newly immigrated people. People who are just becoming aware of what the difference in the norms are. Very often what we're going to find as adults, as they have culture contact with larger Anglo society, all of a sudden find that they have loss of status. Think about this. People who have very high status in their culture of origin, if they don't conform to Anglo norms, have very low status in mainstream culture. And sometimes you're going to find people with transitional adaptation as they're trying to find status. Another thing that I pointed to earlier is the intergenerational conflict that comes from this. So again, what Galan says is that we've got to pay attention back to this model over here, that this transitional status is something that eventually gets resolved, in one of these modes. Does that make sense? Okay, we're going to make this a little bit more complex, so let me stop and ask if there are any questions. None? No questions. Okay, moving right along then. Okay, one of the things that Galan said is that even if we take a look at an X and a Y axis, we still have categories, right? Even if we plot it on an X and a Y axis, let's go back to the tablet for a second, we still have categories, right? We can see people as being assimilated, that's one category. We can see people as being bicultural, that's another category. Traditional, marginal, or transitional. Those are still categories. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. What he said is that when we look at, well, this is a better model, by the way. The model that he's proposing is a better model because it evaluates people not only on how much they conform to mainstream society, but also how much they conform to their own traditional values. You're following that? He says, this is a better model, but it's still incomplete. It's still incomplete. And what he's pointing out is that people are very complex. People are very complex, and, back to the PowerPoint, it says these models do not adequately account for change over time, change over situations. So therefore, putting somebody in a category, he says, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Okay, back to the tablets. Oh, this is a challenge for me. There we go. This is going to be harder to draw. He's added to this, we have the x-axis and the y-axis, right? This is going to be a little bit harder to draw. Okay, here's the model that we were just working with. Right? Is everybody following that? Let me make this neater. Okay, here's our x-axis, here's our y-axis, and here we have our categories of, do you remember what they are? Assimilated, acculturated, we have the transitional there. What do we have here? Traditional and marginal. He says just those 4 boxes, even with the transitional, is not sufficient. He said one of the things that we have to add is what he called the z-axis, and that's the axis of time. And that cuts through this. You all following that? It's the axis of time. Okay, let's talk about this for a second. What he is saying is that all because people come to a certain mode of adaptation doesn't mean they're going to stay there. doesn't mean they're going to stay there. It also doesn't mean that they're going to stay there from day to day or year to year. And what he is pointing out is that bicultural socialization is much, much more complex. A truly bicultural person, for example, we know that somebody who's truly bicultural adopts coping mechanisms for both cultures, right? Adopts high adherence to both. And what that says is that, for example, Anna, when you go home and you're interacting with your culture of origin, you can be 100% Latino. And that means, what would those behaviors look like?
Well, in my case,
Yeah.
I had to be bicultural mostly all of the time because my husband is American.
Okay, but let's say that you go home and you're interacting only with your family of origin and not with your husband.
So I will do the cultural.
Can you give some examples?
Yeah, well, the music or the food, the conversation, which is more relaxed, less formal, and more affection, demonstrate more affection, things like that.
Is there anybody else here who has a culture of origin where they can give me examples about how you interact in your culture? How about you, Jean?
I know that when I go to Peru, you arrive somewhere and you kiss everybody and you hug everybody, older, younger, you may not know them very well. And when I come here, you don't do that. They would think I was a little strange. So there's a lot of that. It's very social. You go to any social occasion and you hug and you give 2 kisses on the cheek.
Okay, what Galan is saying is that we've got to take a look at people's behavior over time and in context. That people have the ability to be totally traditional. Here's when we get to the z-axis of time, that people move back and forth. People, for example, who are truly bicultural, can move back and forth among those boxes. So that when they are with their family and culture of origin, what do they look like? Very traditional. They're speaking their language of origin. They're following all the norms and customs that are expected of them in their family. And for that period of time, they have given up all of the Western ways. You all following that? They get back to their job on Monday morning, and how do they act?
American.
American. That's right. They are no longer hugging and kissing everybody around them. If that was their culture of origin, they are no longer speaking their language, their original language. They are adhering to time frames. Well, what he's saying now, this person looks very assimilated, right? Does that make sense? So that first of all, it depends on context. That if we take a look at how people act over time, just saying that they are acculturated doesn't mean that they necessarily have to be adopting both sets of norms at any point in time. Because if they are truly acculturated, that means that over time, in any situation, they can be totally traditional. Yes? Mm-hmm. They can be totally assimilated. And let's say that they happen to be in a situation, let's go back to what I said about Jennifer or KG before, where she has to interact with both. You adopt the norms and cultures for interacting with both in the same contexts. So one of the things that Galan is saying is that behavior is contextual. And people who have coping skills for both can be truly transactional and change not only with context, that's one, but also change over time. Can you think of examples of people who have given up their culture of origin, become assimilated, and then gone back to their culture of origin? Leah.
Part of my family is German, and they immigrated like in the 1800s or something. But then in World War II, there was just such conflict. They quit speaking German. They quit doing a lot of the stuff that they did. And then afterwards, now some of the siblings, like the grandkids, are starting to say, "Hey, we wish we would have known how to speak German," because they don't know how, and so they're trying to figure that out again.
Absolutely. What we see with people, and sometimes it's different generations, but sometimes within the same person who's grown up in a minority culture, who then becomes so assimilated for various reasons and then starts to mourn the loss of their culture. Well, these categorical models don't cut that. They don't really adequately describe that. And what Galan says, let's go back to the tablet for a second, is that over time, people can adapt if they are truly acculturated. And this is a truly bicultural model, that people who are bicultural really can make choices over time. I have one friend who grew up in a very traditional Jewish family, left her family, became very assimilated. I mean, she grew up speaking Hebrew and Yiddish. For years, she put those languages both behind her, spoke only English, and I'm not going to go into the long story part of it, married her childhood sweetheart, who was also from a very traditional Jewish family, and guess what? Went back to very, very, very traditional Jewish ways. For many years, she was not kosher at all, didn't even go to synagogue. But after she got married and had a child, she now not only was going to synagogue all the time, but became very kosher and followed all the Jewish dietary laws and became extremely, extremely traditional. Extremely traditional. So back to this model, what Galan says is that people over time, and that's what this axis is here, the z-axis, that people have choices. That once you have developed coping skills for both cultures, you have choices about which model of adaptation. Sometimes it's contextual, sometimes it's situational, sometimes people make major, major life changes. Does that make sense to y'all? So it's a much, much more complex model of cultural adaptation than just saying that somebody is assimilated, saying that somebody is acculturated. But it leaves the possibility open for people to change over time, for people to change over contexts. Let me stop for any questions. I'm being that clear today? I love it. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. What Galan's model suggests, it really has, we tend not to think about this. This has very serious implications for how we see personality. Think about this for a second. It has serious implications for how we see personality. Why do you think we saw these people as being marginal and straddling two worlds? Because we believe strongly, because of Western theory, that people have to be integrated. All of our psychological theories stress integration of the self. And therefore, when you see people with two totally different sets of norms, sometimes which conflict, and being able to adapt to both, we say they're marginal because they're not integrated. We call them marginal because we see them as being something less than this Western value of being an integrated self. Very importantly, what this model suggests is that having more than one self can be functional. Again, it suggests that we don't have to have an integrated self, that we can have a self that is different when we are interacting in our culture of origin, and have a totally different self when we're interacting with mainstream society. What are your thoughts about that? Yeah.
Lorena. I think it's. I think that's true. I think that also that we can't forget that we have that within white cultures, different people that are considered white, like even like Northerners. I'm thinking about all my Yankee relatives and how I have lived down here and how
Speak nicely about us Yankees, please.
I know, and but in my family is, and I go and visit my father, and when I interact with him is completely different. How I interact here, with him being Italian and Northern, totally different than how I interact with people here. I won't go into the details, but it's different.
One of the things that I think we make a mistake about is that because many of the white ethnic immigrants that came over at the turn of the 1900s are white, we tend to overlook there are vast cultural differences, that there are intact cultures, absolutely.
And also different because they're from, there's differences from up north and down south. There's a lot.
There are regional differences, absolutely.
Regional, right.
Absolutely. Yeah, Megan.
I was just going to say, I heard recently about a theory that someone was proposing that we all have multiple selves, and that throughout the course of a day, each of us has different, almost completely different personalities at times when you're at work and when you're at home, or when you're with your friends and when you're, with your coworkers and different things like that. So I think to some extent, maybe that speaks to what you were saying, that we have sort of a bias toward an integrated self, but that in reality, most of us don't have fully integrated selves when it comes to our roles and how we conduct ourselves.
Well, we're going to be talking about those theories. That comes out of symbolic interaction, and particularly Irving Goffman's dramaturgical school of symbolic interaction, which we're going to be talking about in this class. Yes, because so many of our psychological theorists have placed such an emphasis on integration of self, that we have to be whole, that we have to be integrated. When we see people with different selves, we see that as pathological. And what you're pointing out is that you don't have to be an ethnic minority person to have multiple selves. However, let's assume that that is true. Think about how much more complex it is for somebody who is an ethnic minority, who not only has the same kind of multiple selves that the rest of us have, but also has that cultural component. Did I see somebody else's hand up? Okay, finally, back to the PowerPoint. What Galan sees as being what he calls the culturally integrated personality is what he sees a consistency within oneself rather than of oneself. Let me repeat that. Consistency within the self rather than of self. Okay, back over to me. And what he means by that is that as long as in any specific role, I feel consistent in that role, in that context, that's what counts. There does not have to be consistency between my culture and larger sustaining culture, but rather that as long as I feel consistent within myself when I'm interacting in Anglo culture, and consistent within myself when I'm interacting with my culture of origin, that is what an truly integrated personality is. Culturally integrated. Not integrated in terms of psychological integration, but culturally integrated. Does that make sense to y'all? Any questions? None? Okay, that's it for today. We will see you next week.